Hi, welcome back to Introduction to World Literature after a brief break from doing these videos. This is my first video after restructuring the course. I just wanted to remind everybody, if you have any questions about the new format of the course, the sort of changed arrangement of some of those assignments and stuff, please do get in touch. I hope that the changes I've made respond effectively to the questions that you guys have about the course and the concerns that you had about it. Today I'm just going to talk a little bit about the new discussion forum that you're being asked to do this week, and the new format of it. I actually had this video nearly finished yesterday, and then a fire alarm went off in CFO and we all had to leave, so unfortunately I missed I'm a day late with this as a result. Just wanted to briefly mention the format of the forum. So you're going to have a much increased level of control over the direction of the conversation this week. In part, this is a reflection of how the course is progressing, that you're being asked to do more in terms of leading the discussion. But also, this discussion forum is going to be very specifically a chance to think about and develop your ideas for your next minor assignment, which is the audio-video response to Chinua Achebe and Edward Said's essays on Heart of Darkness. So we're just going to be discussing your responses to those texts, so that you're spending a week thinking actively about what that response is and what your opinions are, and also subjecting those opinions to the challenge of your classmates, so that you have a more refined idea of where you want to go with your minor assignment and your own response to that. So what you're going to be asked to do is you need to summarize the assigned essays, and you'll also need to formulate a couple of discussion questions. Now, to me, there are some complexities to these texts, things that maybe you don't understand first time out. I think in particular Edward Said's essay could be quite complex for people. That's fine. Ask questions, formulate questions that you think, it's like, this is an area that I'm not clear on and I want to be clear on it. I think it's important to get some clarity. And ask those questions, and maybe together we can work on getting answers to them. What I would suggest, though, is that you also formulate questions that are designed to stimulate discussion. The kinds of questions that I've been asking in forums up until now, which are analytically focused, and invite your classmates to think actively about what you see as the key issues being raised by these two writers. So make sure that you have a mix of those kinds of questions when you're posting. The purpose of all of this, as I say, is to get ready for next week's minor assignment. But asking those kinds of questions forces you to challenge yourself, forces you to think actively about, not just what your stance is or your opinion is on these things, but also to see, well, what are some contradicting ideas that maybe might inform or make my response a bit more complex. Because it's necessary that when we take a stance in relation to something, that we also acknowledge there are other ways of looking at this text, other ways of understanding it. In terms of the actual material, my sense is that Achebe is writing in relatively plain English. It's a plain-spoken piece of writing, and I think it's a really strongly worded critique of Heart of Darkness, for sure. And he dismisses Conrad ultimately as being a racist. He argues that Conrad critiques colonialism, but he's incapable of seeing Africans as fully human. Now, this builds on one of the questions that I was asking you last week, where I asked you to identify a particular passage of Heart of Darkness, either depicting an African person or an African place, and seeing, well, what kind of language does Conrad use to describe those places, or does Marlowe use to describe those places or those people, and what does that tell you about his attitudes to race, or to Africa, or to colonialism, and so on? For Achebe, this is a clear example that he's capable of criticizing colonialism, but he is incapable of recognizing the basic humanity of Africans, that he regards them as lesser or inferior than white Europeans, and therefore it's fundamentally a racist text, and that for all of the emphasis in universities on Heart of Darkness as a sort of psychological exploration of Kurtz or of Marlowe, there isn't nearly enough exploration of the basic racism of the text. Now, we could argue whether we agree with him or not. I think that there are arguments to be made in favor of the complexity of Conrad's view of race, but it's quite compelling, the argument that Achebe puts forward. Said doesn't necessarily disagree with Achebe on the idea that there are racist attitudes being put forth in Heart of Darkness. What he disagrees with is the idea that this means that the text can be written off as racist. What Said is basically arguing is that while the text does embody the kind of racist attitudes that defined imperialism, and while imperialism informs its whole worldview, there's something more interesting going on. So what he says is that this narrative basically interprets Africa in a way that's entirely normal for imperialist texts to do. In other words, it's a place full of inferior people, a blank space whose meaning has not been created yet and will only be created when Europeans occupy it and turn it into part of the imperial system. But what he says is that the narrative structure of the text is complex enough that it complicates this attitude. So what he says is that by having this framing narrative, where Marlowe is telling the story to all of these people, and they don't necessarily trust what he says, and his style of narrating is so strange and so ambivalent and ambiguous, and the wording is all so heightened and artificial, that Said argues that it's drawing attention to its own artificiality, that as a novel it's drawing attention to the fact that this is just made up, this is just one way of seeing the world, it's not necessarily realistic, it's not portraying the reality, it's portraying a way of interpreting the world, and that way of interpreting the world is imperialist, that it defines black people as inferior, it defines Africa as a place to be conquered, and so on, but that because it's a very artificial thing, it's sort of conscious that there is a world outside of this text and a way of interpreting the world outside of the way that Marlowe interprets it. And so that even though Conrad himself can't necessarily imagine another way of thinking about the world, he's conscious that imperialism itself is limited. So while Said is a more complex essay, he is also dealing with maybe some of the complexity of that framing narrative. And again, last week I asked you to think about why there's a framing narrative on this text. And some of your answers were quite good. They really engaged with the idea that Marlowe may not be too reliable, and that these guys who are listening to him maybe don't trust him. But what Said points out is that we also need to look at who is listening to Marlowe. And these guys are a bunch of English businessmen. And so Marlowe is maybe tailoring his story for an audience of English businessmen with all of their assumptions about race and about colonialism and about money and about greed and about resources and stuff like that. And so it's a story that draws attention to the fact that it's for a colonial audience. And so Saeed is maybe making an argument about that, about the limitations of the perspective of this story, whereas for Achebe, it's really a story all about that it's a realist story, that we should take the views of Marlowe as being fundamentally the views of Conrad, whereas for Saeed there's something slightly more complex going on. Let me know if you're having trouble with Saeed's essay, though. In particular, you might be having trouble with Achebe's as well. But let me know if there are things that you're really struggling with. But really, what I want you to do is use the discussion forum as your opportunity to think about things that you're not sure about and that you're confused about. And work together as a class to sort of solve the problems that are presented by these essays. What I would also say is note the change in format. It's not just that you have to formulate those questions and ask them, and it's not just that you have to answer other people's questions. I've also asked that when people respond to your questions, take a little time just at the end of the weekend to respond briefly to all of the people who have posted in response to you, and that way you can close off those discussions, and hopefully there'll be a better sense of interaction. So it's not just I've posted something, somebody responded, and I don't have to care. A few people had asked that we change it up a little bit so there's a better sense of interaction and discussion and dialogue. So that's how we're going to do it this week, and hopefully it'll be good preparation for what you're doing next week, and hopefully it helps to scaffold your response to the next minor assignment. So let me know how it's going. I hope these changes are helpful. I'm looking forward to reading all of your major assignments, the multimodal adaptations. I've had a look at one or two and they look great. So it should be a lot of fun. I'll get back to you as soon as possible. Thanks very much. Have a good one.